Hey there and welcome back to NBA 2K17. My name is Pete and today we complete the first year of NBA 2K17's MyGM or MyLeague mode with the Utah Jazz. Second to last video in the series and we're moving to Utah for this one. And from recent memory alone, I think it's pretty safe to say that the key challenge with the Jazz is to bring back Gordon Hayward. The Jazz have done a formidable job building a strong team in a rather small market, and they have done so without the use of any high-profile trades or free agent signings. And we will try to keep that spirit alive in this video, but before we make our moves, let's first have a look at the situation in Utah. We start with the roster overview and we begin at point guard. And just as a quick info on the side, we are still working with a roster that has, among others, George Hill and Gordon Hayward still on the team, so we are effectively going back to the beginning of the 2016-17 season, and we will try to work our way up from there. But back to the situation at hand, and let's quickly talk about George Hill, who is very likely your starting point guard. Hill is a very good all-around player at the point guard, which actually makes him better suited for the shooting guard, at least that is what 2K thinks. We will leave him at point guard for the moment, but keep an eye on the fact that he is in his contract year. One of the first questions then arises when it comes to the backup point guard spot in Utah. Mac, Axum and Neto will likely all make a claim for minutes, but you will likely not be able to fit all three of them in the rotation. All three of them are on potentially expiring contracts, however for Axum and Neto you have team options, while Mac will also be very likely willing to re-sign with the team. My suggestion here would be Dante Axum, and for several reasons actually. First of all, at 6'6", he's by far the tallest one in the group. On top of that, he's also the youngest and he also has the highest potential rating, meaning that he likely has the highest ceiling. One thing to keep in mind though is that Axum is not the best shooter, although that can of course change over time. Let's move on to the shooting guard now, where things are a lot more clear. Your starter will very likely be Rodney Hood, backed up by Alec Burks. The two of them are a nice combination, especially on the offensive end, and standing at 6'8" tall, Hood also brings some size to the table. With Burks, you have the issue of a rather expensive contract, however the Jazz currently do not have cap space problems. That might change in the next offseason though, and that brings us straight to Gordon Hayward. Your starter at the small forward and the star in Utah is likely expiring. He does have a player option coming up, but don't get your hopes up, he will likely not take that. So in order to keep him on the roster, you will probably have to give him a max contract. The small forward might actually be the strongest position on the Jazz roster, because backup Joe Ingles is actually one of the top 5 players on the team as well. Ingles is an elite shooter and a great defender as well, but just like Hayward, he will also expire after the season, so in just 1 year the small forward could turn from the strongest into a non-existent position on the team. Now, non-existent might be a bit of an overstatement, because one guy you will have for the next 2 seasons is Joe Johnson. Whether or not he's worth $11 million at the age of 35, that is of course up to you to decide. Let's move down low, where the starter at the power forward is once again a young up-and-comer. Being only 25 years old and with a potential rating of over 80, Derek Favors definitely has room to improve even further. Still, at this point, he's a quality starter already. For his backup, you can realistically choose between Trey Lyles and Boris Diaw, although Joe Johnson has played power forward for the Jazz as well. I would personally choose Lyles over the expiring Diaw here. Lyles could transition into a solid stretch 4, and outside shooting is something that your big men currently lack. On top of that, he's 14 years younger than Diaw and already almost as good. Joel Bolomboy is then a reserve player at best for the moment. Not only is he your worst player right now, but there are also some injury concerns with him which might impact his long-term future with the team. At the center position, another rising star has taken Utah by storm, and I am of course talking about Rudy Gobert. Gobert is your defensive anchor down low, and the Jazz made a wise decision locking him down long-term. Gobert's backup for the moment is Jeff Withey, simply by lack of alternatives, since there is a noticeable talent gap between the two. Withey is still only 26 years old, which is not too old, but I think long-term his role is one that could use an upgrade. All in all, we already have a very talented roster on our hands, and one that is actually still a few seasons away from hitting its collective prime. That is a perfect base to build upon, so let's see who might be the potential cracks in the foundation. When we look at the expiring contracts, we see George Hill and Shelvin Mack as candidates for a potential extension, while Ingles and Withey have not been with the team long enough and will therefore definitely hit the open market. Despite his age, Ingles will only become a restricted free agent though, so at least in theory he can be brought back on a qualifying offer. Hill and Ingles are likely the most important players in this group, Hill more so than Ingles, but depending on their role in the rotation, both Mac and Withy should also considered as targets to be brought back. Now, the list of potentially expiring players is of course a bit longer than it might seem here, and it is led by, most importantly, Gordon Hayward. Like I said earlier, Hayward will likely decline his player option and become an unrestricted free agent, and therefore bringing him back on a long-term contract should be one of your top priorities. The Jazz also have a total of 6 team options coming up, and as usual, some of them are more attractive than others. While bringing back Rodney Hood for not even $2.5 million per year is likely a no-brainer, and Axum, Lars and Nito are also probably too young to pass up on, the options on Bolomboy and Diao can definitely be argued against. For your long-term plans, it makes sense to already have an idea of who you want to extend and who you don't want to keep. On most teams, those long-term plans are influenced by the cap space. The Jazz, however, have a rather relaxed situation in this regard. Yes, they will likely have to sign both Hill and Hayward to large long-term contracts, but with over $40 million in projected cap space, that should be more than manageable. Keep in mind that while you have the bird rights to Hayward and can therefore go over the cap to re-sign him, you do not have those bird rights for George Hill, meaning you should probably sign him first. Or as a general rule of thumb, always sign the guys with bird rights last. Now, to wrap up our situation overview, let's also have a look at draft picks, and the Jazz are in a very good position here. Even though that 2017 first-round pick from the Warriors will likely not bring in another star, it is another first-rounder that you can use in trades, for example. The Jazz have also acquired an additional first-round pick for the next season from the Thunder, although that one has a lottery protection. All in all, with this wide array of draft picks, it is definitely possible to continue to collect assets for the future. And that brings us to our 3 key questions. 3 questions that need to be answered before going into year 1 with the Jazz. Question number 1, who will be your backup point guard? I already mentioned this earlier in the position overview, but behind George Hill, 3 players make a viable claim for minutes. All of them have their strengths and also their weaknesses. All of them could, at least in theory, no longer be with the team next season, so it's a good idea to make this decision early. Question number 2, how attached are you to Joe Johnson? Right now, Joe Johnson is actually the 7th best player on the team. That in itself would be more than deserving of solid minutes off the bench. Sadly, he occupies a position that is already stacked, and he's also not exactly cheap. It is possible to make some position changes at the small forward, either for Johnson or for Ingles, and that could allow you to keep him in a more serviceable role on the team. On the other hand, he's not getting any younger and might be a valuable trade asset while he's healthy. And third question, are you willing to go over the salary cap and maybe also over the luxury tax? Now, on first sight, the cap situation in Utah definitely looks very solid. However, if you actually decide to bring back all the guys you have team options for, maybe minus Boris Diaw, then the new contracts for Hill and Hayward will likely exceed your salary cap. Now, going over the cap gives you a lot less flexibility, so this is definitely something to think about. Now, since you have Hayward's bird rights, you could theoretically leave him for last and use the 30-35 million you have after team options and spend those on Hill and one other player. Doing so could maybe allow you to bring another borderline star to Utah. However, if you then sign Hayward on top of that, you will likely go into the luxury tax. And that is something you might not want to do unless it puts you in a prime position to win a championship. Now, as usual, one last thing before we go into the moves. Here is the list of players I would personally not trade in Utah. Of course, that list is headlined by Hayward and Gobert, followed by Derek Favors. And yes, George Hill is not on the list, simply because his future with the team is a bit uncertain, and then again he's already 30 years old. I would also put Ingles on the list on the condition that he's willing to sign an extension with you, as well as Rodney Hood because of his incredibly cheap team option. And with that, I think we have now thoroughly examined the Jazz in their current situation. We have also identified some potential risks, so let us now make some moves to improve the team. Without any further ado, here are 3 moves to make in your first year as GM of the Utah Jazz. Move number 1, trade Joe Johnson. Johnson is really only serviceable at one position, and that is the small forward. That position, however, is occupied by 2 players who are still better than him and who both also have a much higher ceiling. Now, Ingles could in theory be switched to the shooting guard and he would actually get a rating increase for that, but at 6'8" and with limited mobility, that move hardly makes sense. That leaves Johnson the odd man out, and that is a role you should not pay $11 million a year for. Johnson's trade value is very solid. There are actually straight-up trades for Dwight Howard available. However, we will now look at more realistic options. Speaking of Dwight Howard though, we will try to acquire a center here, because the Jazz are definitely lacking strong backup big men. What we're looking for here is primarily an upgrade over Jeff Withey, although ideally a guy who can play both the power forward and the center position. Now Johnson is actually extremely overrated when it comes to his trade value, so let's try and identify some trades that actually make sense for both sides involved. Now of course, if you want to, you can sign Jared Sullinger from the free agent pool, but that is definitely the easy way out. For trades, the first one I would have a look at is Joe Johnson for Robin Lopez from Chicago. Lopez is only 28, so his 77 overall rating will likely stay that way for the next few seasons. He does come with a rather hefty price tag for the next 3 years though, but he actually doesn't earn much more than Johnson does. Now Chicago would lose their starting center in this scenario, but they would get a small forward who's very capable of filling the backup spot behind Jimmy Butler. Now if you think that Chicago will likely man that position with a guy like Nikola Mirotic, then this trade does not make too much sense, but it's an option that is there if Chicago would be willing to go for a rebuild, for example. Another very interesting player would be John Henson from the Bucks. One could argue that with Greg Monroe and Thon Maker already in the rotation down low in Milwaukee, John Henson's opportunities for playing time will likely be somewhat limited. At least with the current 2K ratings, it makes sense if the Bucks were to prioritize Maker over him, and so they might realistically also try to get rid of him, since Henson's salary is a handful. Now Henson is only 25 and therefore still has a bit of room to improve, but then again he's also not much younger than Withey, and he would only be a 1 rating point improvement, and it's questionable whether or not that's actually worth paying 10 times the salary. Now the guy I eventually went with was Thiago Splitter from the Sixers, and now you might rightfully criticize that Splitter is an expiring contract. However, that was exactly the purpose of this trade. While Withey is not the greatest player right now, he will still improve a bit. For this season we could use an upgrade, and that is exactly what Splitter is for, while next season Withey should be equally as serviceable. The expiring contract of Thiago Splitter also fulfills another purpose, and that is to avoid getting into the luxury tax next season. Bringing back Hill and Hayward will probably cost you a combined $50 million or more, and if you also accept a few team options, sign a rookie and extend the qualifying offer for Joe Ingles, all those contracts together will very likely push you into the luxury tax if you still have Johnson's or a comparable contract on board by then. So Splitter joins the squad for 1 year, he will replace Withey in the rotation, and with this first move made, we can now continue right with the second one. And now for move number 2, we will trade one of our backup point guards. I think it's a bit excessive having 3 backup point guards around, especially when your starting point guard is a very capable one like George Hill. I would personally hold on to Dante Exum, and based on your preference you can then move either Mac or Neto. Now Neto might have a bit more value for other teams thanks to his team option, while Mac is definitely the safer bet when it comes to injuries. I would recommend having a look at what you can get for both, and then just go with the offer you like best. If you can, maybe try and get a third shooting guard on the roster. Realistically, that should put a bit more pressure on Alec Burks and also give you a bit more flexibility here, and maybe eventually also the possibility to trade away Burks and his $33 million contract. One such player could for example be the Andre Liggins from the Mavericks. While Liggins is already 28 years old, he's also very cheap and will actually continue to be for the next 3 seasons. Another potential candidate would be Rodney McGruder from Miami. He is 25, once again very cheap for the foreseeable future, and the Heat would get themselves some much needed help at point guard. Guys like Josh Richardson, Andre Robertson or Ben McLemore could also be available, but I feel like their ceiling is considerably higher than what you have to offer. And so in the end I actually went with McGruder for Neto and the Warriors' first round pick, a pick that, let's be honest, won't really be of much use for us. McGruder could now realistically take Burks' spot in the rotation, which might be reason enough to trade Burks now. I, however, kept them both on the roster and proceeded straight to move number 3. And move number 3 would be to re-sign George Hill and also Shelvin Mack if possible. Of course, if Mack is no longer with the team because you traded him in move number 2, then you can skip him, but if George Hill is willing to re-sign, then he should be brought back under all circumstances. Now you are able to bring him back longer term in regular free agency, but he's already 30 years old, so the 3-year contract extension is probably enough. If he's not willing to re-sign, that's not the end of the world either, then you can simply bring back Shelvin Mack on a cheap deal for a few years, that is if you still have him. In free agency I would then accept the team options of Rodney Hood, Dante Exum and Trey Lyles, and if you followed my moves, then also the one for Rodney McGruder. Ballon Boy can be brought back if you want to, but Diaw should likely be declined. And declined is a good point because Gordon Hayward will do so with his player option, and your task is to now bring him back. Before you do, I would extend a qualifying offer to Joe Ingles, but be prepared to match offer sheets. Then in regular free agency, your two most pressing issues are of course George Hill and Gordon Hayward, but you should have no trouble bringing both of them back if you sign Hill first and Hayward last. And that should also pretty much fill your roster. If you want to, you can also re-sign Jeff Withey. He should have made some nice progress during the season, but all in all, if you want to keep things fairly realistic, your roster will probably not change too much. And with that, I think you can now feel free to enter your next season and hopefully continue to push the Jazz to new heights. That would be it from my part. As usual, if you liked the video, then leave a thumbs up, and I will then see you in Washington for the series finale. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.